Good evening, everybody. As Miranda said, my name is Taffy Lee, and I'm the board chair of Colorado Humanities. And we are, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you to the Book Bar. We're so happy to have such a great venue for our 31st annual Colorado Book Awards finalist reading series. Thank you also to our sponsors, Unite in Literacy. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And Unite in Literacy and the Colorado Sun, with whom we partner on Sunlit Sunday excerpts of Colorado authors' books. Before we get to the readings, I'd like to introduce you all to our Colorado Center for the Book Program Coordinator, Mary Hickey, and Marketing Coordinator, Betsy Lopez. Both of you wave to the audience. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce you to 5 talented writers whose books have been named by Colorado Book Awards selectors as the finalist in the history and biography categories. The finalists from the history category will start, followed by finalists in the biography category. We'll move quickly, keeping everyone to their time limit, which I think is 6 minutes. Mary will raise a finger to indicate that the finalists have a minute or so to finish their reading. So look in her direction when you're reading.
Which finger is she?
Copies of all the finalists' books are available for purchase anytime, and you can ask finalists to sign your books, and please enjoy Book Bar's great snacks and drinks during and after the readings. Colorado Humanities has also sprung for a few snacks, which are on this table over here. So please take the opportunity to get yourself something if you haven't eaten yet. There will be a Q&A with each author after he or she reads, and at the end of the readings, I hope all the authors will stay and get their books, sign their books, and answer any other questions that the audience may have. Our first reader in the history category tonight is Karl Kristian Krumpholz, who will read from his book, Queen City, A Brief History and Illustrated Architecture, New and Old of Denver, Colorado. Karl's artwork has appeared in many different formats, publications, and has been animated in a documentary. Karl is currently working on several projects, including the weekly The Denver Bootleg comic for Westward, his daily autobiographical comic called The Lighthouse in the City, and the continuing series of short stories and slight of life comics set in the city, 30 Miles of Crazy. Karl lives in Denver. Karl?
All right. Hello, everyone. All right. So my book, Queen City, is not really a very straightforward history or narrative. It's more of an art as well as a history book, broken down by various neighborhoods around Denver. Because of that, thank you very much. Because of that, I thought it might be good to see some of my illustrations from the book right next to me as I talk about the development and why I did this book. It all starts off from the fact that I am not from around here. I'm originally from the East Coast, and Denver has always been my wife's city. I've lived here for over a decade now, and still, in some ways, Denver still confuses me. I encounter things that makes me baffled like a dog seeing a card trick. One of the ways I've found to deal with this confusion is to start with the history, the collection of facts and stories that make up a place. For example, I might be out with a friend, walking through the park and someone casually mentions to me, "Hey, have you ever heard about all the bodies buried in Cheeseman Park?" Stunned amazement. Tell me more. That's how history pulls you in. Sometime back, I was wandering around the River North area, which, when I moved here, was a neighborhood of warehouses and art galleries. All the warehouses are gone now, replaced by condos, apartments, new bars, and restaurants. And with all the development came a new name, Rhino. Things changed. When we lose something, a place, it can be quite hurtful and horrible. It can be like the death of a friend. A bit of the city's old character is gone, to be replaced by something new. This is true, and it might lead people to think that Denver is disappearing. The city that we knew may be different, but it's not just disappearing. It's changing and evolving. One of the old adages that I heard when I first came here was that if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes. This is the same thing. Something new will always come along. A lot has changed in the few years that I've been in the city. And I first started to notice these changes, some time ago, pre-COVID. First there was Shelby's, if anyone knows that. Was down on 18th Street. Was down. Pretty much it was the only neighborhood bar downtown. It was also named Esquire magazine's one of their best bars in America. It's closed, and it's now a parking lot. There's also Barracuda's in my neighborhood near Capitol Hill, and it served that neighborhood for 25 years. It closed in 2019. And also, which everyone probably knows, is El Chapultepec, down on Market Street. It was there for 87 years. Denver has lost some truly special places to replace by something different. These long-running local places may be replaced by, new fancy cocktail spots that really had no connection with the neighborhood. Or it could be that the neighborhood is changing while no one's looking. I've always thought that there was two types of stories in history: the grand stories and the small stories. The grand sort of stories are the ones in the history books, the ones that people remember, the ones about the various buildings and plaques that you see around the city. It's about the conflicts and the so-called great men. But the small stories are the ones people generally look over. The day-to-day slice-of-life stories of people in the city just trying to get by. People who might be familiar with my other work, my comic work, know that these are the small stories that I'm interested in. But when you discuss the history of a city, you got to blend both these two types of stories. As I mentioned, Denver is my wife's city. I was drawn to these stories to try to understand the place I was now living, to get an outsider's view. It helped immediately when I started doing the weekly Denver bootleg comic for the Westward. I was interviewing people, getting the history of the various venues in the city. That research took a few years and is the backbone of the Queen City book. I started drawing the various buildings and locations to try to put some sort of character of those places in my illustrations. When I only even had a handful of places and I started posting them on social media going, hey, this is what I'm working on right now, I instantly started getting, have you done this place? Have you thought about doing this? You need to do this place. And after I do illustration after illustration after illustration, suddenly I had a book. So that is where Queen City came from. The central idea is we know that things are always going to change in a city, but I just wanted to put a marker down saying that this is what Denver was like in the start of the 21st century. And here are some of the stories about the places that are gone, and I want to make sure that people did not forget them. The city and the progress of history is all about change and moving forward while keeping respect and deference to the past. You don't have to like it, but you better learn to live with it because you really can't stop it. Like life, cherish what you have in a city because no one knows how long it will last. And I really hope that's what comes across in Queen City. Thanks.
Thank you, Karl. Karl will stay up here, and if anyone has any questions for him, please ask them. And Karl, if you could repeat the question in the microphone after, thank you.
Why is Denver nicknamed Queen City?
Okay, the reason it's called Queen City. Why is Denver nicknamed Queen City? The reason I named the book Queen City, I was looking around. I really didn't want to do Mile High something or Cowtown something. I wanted to do a better nickname for Denver. And when I was looking around, Queen City of the Rockies or Queen City of the Plains also popped up. The slight flaw in this is apparently there is like a lot of queen cities in America, and not even in America, in Canada and around. There's because I had a couple of people email me going, well, I don't know, Cincinnati's Queen City, or somewhere in North Carolina's Queen City. But Denver, one of the nicknames of Denver is Queen City of the Rockies or Queen City of the Plains. Yes.
What's the most interesting location that people emailed you? Have you booked about this and you didn't know about that you found?
What is the most interesting location that people emailed me about and that I did not know about? There's quite a few. I'm racking my brain right now. Well, the one request that I really got was Terminal Bar. That used to be downtown. That was the one a lot of people requested. That one and Muddy's Coffee House. Now, both these places closed a long time ago before I moved here. Muddy's was a little easier, but the Terminal Bar, when I did the illustration of that, that was the hard one because I could find no photos of Terminal Bar as a reference photo. I knew exactly where Terminal Bar was. It was I believe it's a Jack's seafood and sushi place downtown by the actual Union Station. So I can look at Google Maps and see the shape of the building, but I had no reference on what the building actually looked like. And when I was getting those requests is when we were in lockdown. So the first thing I did was email the Westward, since I have a working relationship with the Westward, going, do you have any photos of Terminal Bar? And they said, yes, we're in lockdown. We're not in the office, so we can't get to them. So the second thing I did was email the library and the History Colorado Center. Both of them said, we will check our archives, see if we have photos of the Terminal Bar. That went on for a month. I heard nothing, heard nothing, heard nothing. And they eventually came back to me and said, yeah, we can't find any. I vented my frustration on Twitter. Within 15 minutes, I had a photo of the Terminal Bar. Which I was like, that would have saved a lot more time if I just went to Twitter first. So yes. Anything else? Oh, here we go.
What place did you visit that you missed that is no longer around now?
What place did I visit that I missed that is no longer? Oh, there's a lot of places that are no longer around right now that I remember. Though I did not mention Gabor's. That was pretty much the first place my wife took me to when I was first visiting Denver. That is like that. There's recent places that have closed that are featured in the book that I drew when I was putting together the book that are no longer there. Like another one was Tui's off Colfax, is one of my old locals. I love that place so much. Let me see if I can think one more. And it's, yes, I'm naming bars. Streets of London is another one that I frequented a lot. But I'm more amazed that there are certain places that have survived the pandemic that I always thought would not, like Nob Hill on East Colfax and the Lion's Lair on East Colfax. Both of them are still seeming to go strong. There's other places like venues, like Three Kings is gone. It's now replaced by HQ. So yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
I noticed you had a picture of Herb's Hideaway.
Herb's Hideaway, yes.
Most people don't have any clue where that is, or
The Herbs that's downtown.
Yeah.
Yes.
you used to have to enter from the alley.
Oh, I did not know that. Herb's Hideaway, well, Herb's now, they dropped the Hideaway when Herman's Hideaway opened, was a great little spot to interview. When I was talking with the current owner, this was again pre-pandemic, and she was telling me all these stories. Again, it's another one of those places I mention in the book a lot of times. The amount of places that I've interviewed that claim Jack Kerouac drank there is, you can't swing a dead cat. And the owner said, we actually had a photo. And I was like, what happened to the photo? We lost it. Okay, great. And they told me a couple Tom Waits stories about, someone wanted to kick out a bum that was in the alley, and it was Tom Waits. Again, back in the 70s when he was touring. But yeah, Herb's was, it opened, if I remember correct, it opened the day after Prohibition ended. And it's always been called Herb's. I think they've gone through 4 owners, and it's always been called Herb's. It's a great venue, bar. My only complaint about it is it opens at 7. I'd like to get in there early, do some day drinking or something like that. Good Manhattans. And it's funny because the couple times I've been to Herb's, they've always remembered me. And I thought that was fantastic. And I was talking to the bartender one night, and he's like, it's your glasses. So you're like, I remember the round glasses. I'm like, great. Is that it? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karl. Next up, Adrian Miller will read his book called Black Smoke, African American and the United States of Barbecue. Adrian Miller is a writer, attorney, and certified barbecue judge who served as a special assistant to President Clinton, a senior policy analyst for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter, and is a Southern Foodways Alliance board member. He lives in Denver. Adrian?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. I have to admit something. So I had a vegetarian meal for dinner, and so I just didn't feel right. So in order to get in the right spirit, I went to the barbecue place and got something before I came over here. So just wanted you to know that. Yeah. So I wrote this book called Black Smoke, African Americans, United States of Barbecue, and I'm going to read the opening anecdote. Dude, you smell like bacon. I mean, like really bad. Those words greeted me when I returned from lunch to the oppressively small office in the Colorado State Capitol that I shared with Leslie Herod, a fellow policy staffer for Governor Bill Ritter Jr. Herod's rebuke dry rubbed me the wrong way for several reasons. First, she was horribly imprecise. My perfumed state wasn't caused by bacon. It was from a barbecue meal that I had recently consumed at Boney's Smokehouse, known as simply as Boney's, a black-owned barbecue restaurant in downtown Denver. Second, I figured, that particular smell should be welcome in most social situations. Why call me out so vociferously? Third, I had to admit that she had a point. Unbeknown to Leslie, within precisely 3 hours from her olfactory observation, I desperately needed to smell clean. Why? I had a blind date with Barbara. At least I'll call her Barbara because I think that sounds a lot like barbecue, and I want to protect her privacy. Now, I'm not going to lie, I panicked. All week long, I had anticipated my date with Barbara, and I felt that I was about to seriously mess things up. Given the nature of my job as a senior policy analyst for Governor Ritter, I didn't have enough time to go home, bathe, change clothes, return, and still get all of my work done. I also tried, to no avail, to find some Febreze or a similar deodorizer. All of those people in that big old building, and I couldn't find one bottle. I felt I had no other choice. I called Barbara, made up an excuse, and asked her if we could reschedule. I just didn't want her to thinking that I had a hygiene problem. After all, it wasn't like we had been connected through www.barbecuepeoplemeet.com. If by chance you think I should have gone ahead with the date, and I'm wondering, how many people think it's a good idea to show up on a date smelling like bacon? Okay. As I finish this, I'm guessing that you've either been married or single for a very long time. So I start with this story of unrequited love because my contention is that that's how African American barbecue people feel now from media. Media, the people that decide what barbecue stories get told and shared, have fallen softly, tenderly, deeply, and madly in love with white dudes. And it's really four kind of white dudes that they've fallen in love with. It's when it comes to barbecue. It's the competition guy, somebody like Tuffy Stone if you're into this world, or you've got the Bubba type, like the rural working class guy. Myron Mixon is a good example of this. Then you also have the hipster type, Aaron Franklin, who's the most recognized barbecue guy in the world. He's got this interesting facial hair, glasses, tattoos, piercings, all that kind of stuff. And then you've got fine dining chefs who are in barbecue in ways they never were before. I call them the tokes who smoke. So I wrote this book because if you understand barbecue history, African Americans had a significant role in shaping it, developing it, and getting it to what it was by the 20th century, a beloved cuisine. So I go back, and the way that I've organized this book is I go through kind of barbecue history. So I argue, and not everybody is feeling this, I argue that what we understand as barbecue today is Native American in its foundation. It's in Virginia that then later Europeans who come and colonize and then enslaved Africans were brought later. That collaboration over decades puts us on the road to Southern barbecue. But then black people become the go-to cooks for barbecue because the way that old school barbecue was done was this way. You got some open area, you dug a pit. The pit was usually a couple of feet deep and then several feet wide. And then somebody chopped a whole bunch of wood down and they would fill that pit up with wood and burn it. And then they would have a separate fire going called a feeder fire. And then they would butcher all the animals that they were gonna cook. And in the South, it was not just pigs. It could be cows, it could be sheep, it could be pigs, it could be goats, it could be anything, possum, all kinds of things showed up. And then somebody had to process those animals. And usually what they did is they butterflied the carcass and they spread it out and they put poles between, kind of in the sides of the carcass. And then it was the job of someone to periodically flip that carcass to make sure that the meat was cooked evenly. Somebody else's job was to look for the cold spots in the pit and supply the fresh coals to keep even temperature. And another person's job was to swab it periodically with a vinegar and red pepper sauce. That was the original barbecue sauce. And then other people were making the side dishes and practicing instruments and all this other stuff. And the reason why they were doing this is because barbecue for 200 years was a black experience from beginning to end in terms of its preparation, its service, and then black people were asked to be the entertainers after the barbecue was done. And the reason why black people got connected to this, because it was very labor intensive, and the racial dynamic of the South is if you're gonna have some people do all this work for free, you had enslaved African Americans do it. So by the early 1800s, you have newspaper articles saying, they're talking about barbecue being made, and they go out of the way to say, in the language of the time, to say that a Negro man or a colored man made this. And so really, it's not until the end of the 19th century that you see more and more white men getting into barbecue. But still, even as that happens, a lot of these white barbecue men who were celebrated in the press had an all-black staff. So still, the dynamic for cooking great barbecue, and they recognized, the barbecue ambassadors were African Americans. So then you fast forward to the late 80s and early 90s, and this is when things change in terms of the media. Because before the late 80s, it would have been weird to have a story on barbecue and not include African Americans. But you have these people called foodies. I'm one of them. I take pictures of my food and all that kind of stuff. And foodies were getting intensely interested in different aspects of American food. And foodies were asking two questions. Well, what's this thing called barbecue? Because if you weren't in the South, you didn't really have a good concept of it. And then where do I get the good stuff? So the media that was catering this rising group of foodies, instead of spreading the love and showing a lot of diversity in barbecue, they gravitated to these white dudes. So much so that I'll close with this anecdote. By the time you get to 2004, I'm working on my first book on the history of soul food, and I was gonna include a chapter on barbecue, but I said, you know what? I'm gonna do a separate book on barbecue because I'd found so much material, I thought it needed its own treatment. So I'm watching the Food Network, and I see this show being advertised called Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. So I'm thinking, you know, I'm just going to watch this show, find out what the latest trends are and what the leading lights are. And after 60 minutes, when the credits are rolling, not one black person was featured on that show. So I thought two things. First of all, I thought, well, this is 2004. I mean, how does this even happen? And then the second thing I thought was, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe I didn't pay attention closely to the commercial, and it was actually for Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue. So I wondered, well, is this an isolated example? And so I started looking at other media, and it was endemic. By the time you get to the 2000s, especially with the rise of Barbecue Pitmasters, the TV show, pretty much white guys were the ones that are being celebrated in barbecue. So Black Smoke is just a thump on the head to say, if you're gonna talk about barbecue in the United States, you need to include African Americans in the narrative, and this is a restoration of African Americans to that story. So that's why I wrote Black Smoke. Thank you.
How did your date with Barbara go, and did you take her for barbecue?
Yes, so I fessed up, and of course she said, oh, I love the smell of bacon, right? So we did go on a date, it went really well, and then we went on a few more dates, but I noticed that I was the one doing most of the work. So I just pulled back a little bit just to see if she would show her brother just some love, right? I just waited for her to make the next move and reach out to me. So it's been about 10 years, so, you know, year 8, I figured I just should let it go, so. Thanks for asking, though. Yeah.
A lot of my family's from Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
As a kid, I would go to Memphis to visit my grandparents, and we'd go out barbecue, and it was a great equalizer. Black people very often ran the restaurants, worked there. White people would be. Did barbecue kind of move from a certain area? I mean, did it move from the south? You have Kansas City, Chicago, Carolinas. Where do you think ground zero?
That's a great question. So the question is, what is ground zero for barbecue, and then how does it move? So my contention is that ground zero is Virginia, because the earliest indications we have of barbecue are from Virginia. Now, there is, I'll make this really quick. The word barbecue itself describes the raised platform that Columbus and his crew saw, where they were seeing small animals, fish, iguanas, and vegetation cooked. That's the first sighting of barbecue by people not from the Americas. And so barbecue is an approximation of the word that the indigenous people were using for the platform, the raised platform, not the cooking process or the food itself. So using Spanish, it was barbacoa, and then playing a game of historical telephone, in English it becomes barbecue. So, but the barbecue that we know, the Southern pit barbecue that I just described, is not cooking on a raised platform. So to me, the argument is that Europeans saw a shallow pit method that the indigenous people were using in Virginia, and then modified that, and then enslaved Africans get in the mix, and that leads to the southern part. So the early story of barbecue is Virginia. In fact, in a lot of the early sources, before you get to Southern barbecue or other states listed, it's always Virginia. But barbecue follows slavery. So it's when people in Virginia go to Kentucky, Georgia, the Carolinas, East Texas, barbecue soon follows, because these people show up with this tradition and they want to show, they want to show off in this new locale. So you have an article in the 1820s of a guy in Kentucky hosting a Virginia barbecue. So that's now not everybody agrees with that. There are some people, I'm getting a lot of flack, especially from African Americans, because they're saying, no, black people invented barbecue in Africa. But there's just no historical proof of that. And look, I wanted to prove that black people created barbecue because I wanted to do that, say Wakanda forever, you know? But you have to go where the evidence leads you. And it's just like, you don't hear the word barbecue until people come to the Americas and encounter it there. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in Argentina, and there we had the asado. And I don't know if you've gone and partaken in a true asado, but I'm curious, like, how those traditions and the way that goes compares to, like, the way it's evolved here, because they both come from the same area, but have evolved completely differently.
Yeah, so the question is, looking at traditions in Argentina, South America, like how do they differ? So yeah, I think it's just a matter of what was the foundation laid by the indigenous people in that area. So to me, and then the interaction of Europeans with that. And notice that in Argentina, there was an African presence early, but it really kind of disappears over time. And so we don't see Southern barbecue as we understand it in these other places. So I would argue that what we saw in Argentina was a mix of European smoking traditions interacting with the indigenous people there. And so I think that accounts for the different ways that barbecue shows up. I think the closest to pit barbecue that we see in the Americas, if you're familiar with Mexico and kind of South Texas, they have more of an earth oven approach where instead of a pit that's like horizontal and stretched out, it's deeper in the ground. And the difference is you would have stones and wood burned, and then they would put in meat wrapped or protected by vegetation and layer it, and then cover it or with dirt or with something else and smoke it that way. Very similar to like the Kahlua pig in Hawaii, right? But if you eat that type of barbecue, you'll notice that it's not really smoky, right? Because it's been protected, but it is tender and it's delicious and it's been broken down. So I think it's really just what were the indigenous people doing and how did Europeans interact with that, and then other populations over time, notably if there were enslaved Africans involved in the mix. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I think accounts for the differences. It's just like that, there's always some kind of mix, and some people call this a creolization process, but there's always a different mix of Europeans, indigenous people, and maybe Africans that I think account for those differences. Back there, did you have a question? Oh, guess not. Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrian. Our third finalist in the history category, Martin J. Smith, will read from his book titled Going to Trinidad, A Doctor, a Colorado Town, and Stories from an Unlikely Gender Crossroads. Martin is a veteran journalist and former senior editor of the Los Angeles Times Magazine and the author of 5 crime novels and 4 nonfiction books. He has won more than 50 newspaper and magazine writing awards, and his novels have been nominated for 3 of the publishing industry's most prestigious honors, including the Edgar Award, the Anthony Award, and the Barry Award. He lives in Granby. Martin?
I tend to talk like a guy who's off his medication. So I want to congratulate the organizers of this event for putting a time limit on me. And whenever I do events like this, I think back to what someone once told me, which was, you know, writers can talk about themselves and their work for hours, when in most cases a simple apology would do. So that's always in the back of my head as I take the microphone. So my book is called Going to Trinidad. I moved to Colorado in 2016 from Southern California, don't hate me, and started hearing stories about Trinidad as this remarkable gender crossroads. For 41 years, between 1969 and 2010, there were 2 surgeons who operated there, starting again in 1969 doing gender confirmation surgeries. And as I started looking into this story, I'll go back to what Karl said. You know, it's the small stories that often illuminate the bigger stories, and this is the perfect example of that. You know, here was this place with this very charismatic surgeon at the center of it. And over those 41 years, 6,000 medical pilgrims came from around the world to Trinidad, Colorado, population 8,000, for this radical surgery that you know, continues to be debated to this day. And I just thought, you know, again, there's an opportunity there to tell that story, tell that small story in a way that's going to make this mystifying idea of gender dysphoria accessible to someone like me, who grew up in a binary world, right? You were either male or you were female, or you were a few degrees one side or the other of that, and that was that. There's a vast middle, and that's incomprehensible to many people. And I wanted to use the Trinidad story to dive into that idea and explore it. And this was happening in 2016, 2017, when the transgender ban in the military was floated, and all of a sudden this was a very hot topic of conversation. 2015, Caitlyn Jenner is on the cover of Vanity Fair. It seemed like the right time to tell that story and make it accessible to people like myself. And so I'm going to read you here is a short section from chapter 3 of Going to Trinidad. You need to know a couple things. One is Stanley Biber is the name of the original surgeon who started doing that. He's referenced in this. The book itself traces the storylines of 2 particular patients who came to Trinidad at different times, their time before, during, and after their transitions. Their names are Claudine Griggs and Walt Heyer. They are also referenced in here. There's one other name referenced. It's another surgeon named Marcie Bowers. She's a transgender surgeon who, in the early 2000s, as Stanley Biber was aging out, he couldn't get medical insurance anymore. He was looking for a protege, someone to train. Marcie Bowers was a transgender surgeon from Seattle who moved to Trinidad and took over his practice when he died in 2006. Not all roads led to Trinidad between 1969 and 2010. But for 41 years in the worldwide transgender community, a startling number of them did. By the time both Walt Heyer returned to Stanley Biber's office in 1983 and Claudine Griggs showed up in 1991, the phrase going to Trinidad already was well understood shorthand among transgender men and women, easier than saying, I've made the most difficult decision of my life, and certainly easier than trying to explain the pain, self-loathing, and emotional and psychological uncertainty that brought someone to the side entrance of the First National Bank building, up the creaking archaic elevator or the steep stairs to Dr. Biber's 4th floor office for a pre-surgery consultation. Going to Trinidad covered it, and for those who understood, a simple nod of the head was the only response required. Trinidad's role in transgender history has been well known in Colorado for decades. Pueblo native and Colorado historian Tim Nicholas recalls talk of Trinidad during his middle and high school days, the invocation of its name a convenient insult to a classmate's manhood. Bucky Carr of Boulder, Biber's nurse anesthetist at Mount St. Raphael Hospital for a decade, also remembers hearing Trinidad used as a handy taunt, a running joke for snarky Coloradans. High school boys would say, if you're going to whine and cry like a girl, why not go to Trinidad and become one, he recalls. But outside the state, even today, among the estimated 1.4 million transgender men and women in the US, the role Trinidad played in the gender identity universe remains to most an improbable surprise. It's not exactly clear why, and those who do know about it are likely part of the LGBTQ community. By the mid-1990s, Biber's work was making headlines in other distant and significant publications, so it's not that word wasn't getting out. The Los Angeles Times featured Biber in a 1995 story headlined, "The Bodybuilder," noting in a secondary headline that Biber had already been correcting nature's miscues for 25 years. Out magazine's story that same year told a similar tale beneath the headline, "Biber People." It featured a photo of Biber in surgical scrubs, and also one with the surgeon wearing his trademark Western shirt and cowboy hat, and standing outside the bank building where his professional offices were housed. Biber was even name-checked and featured in a March 9th, 2005 episode of the animated TV series South Park, called Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, in which the transgender schoolteacher character travels to see a Dr. Biber at the Trinidad Medical Center to undergo the surgery. Despite the occasional spotlight stories and pop culture acknowledgments, Trinidad, as sex change capital of the world, as the New York Times called it, didn't seem to register much in the American consciousness during those years, and it was easy to dismiss as a distant, somewhat sensational signal emanating from the middle of nowhere. Transgender people were the ultimate other, unfamiliar, a little scary, hard to fathom, but day in, day out, week after week, month after month, year after year, the pilgrims came. In addition to other surgical duties, Biber and his eventual successor, Dr. Marcie Bowers, often were doing 3 or more gender confirmation surgeries per week. And what happened in Trinidad didn't stay in Trinidad. Their patients invariably returned home to lives, communities, and careers, many becoming emissaries for an idea that to some still seems foreign and freakish. The Trinidad Pilgrims began colonizing schools, offices, and churches, bringing with them the uncomfortable fact that transgender men and women are people with joys, sorrows, ambitions, and goals that aren't much different from anyone else's. When the other is your cousin or friend or coworker, they're damned hard to demonize. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Adrian.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the pioneering doctor and why he got into this field?
You know, we all look for a great character at the center of these stories, right? So Stanley Biber was a MASH unit surgeon in Korea. Very well known for doing lots and lots of surgeries really fast and being pretty good at it. He came out of that experience. He learned a lot of what we would now call microsurgeries. There were a lot of lower body extremity injuries from landmines and things like that in the Korean War. And he got very good at reconstructing urinary tracts and reproductive organs from soldiers. He came back, he moved back, he took a job as a clinic coordinator at a UMW place in Trinidad. They were opening a clinic for the miners. He came back and became essentially the town surgeon. If you go to Trinidad even today, everybody was either, delivered by Stanley Biber or, he just became the guy. And in 1969, he often did work with social workers in the county. He worked with a woman who worked with children who had cleft palates. She came to him one day in '69, and they were talking about their cases that they were working on. At the end of that interview, she said, would you consider doing my surgery? And he said, sure, what do you got? He was a jack of all trades. He'll do anything. He literally was sort of doing hemorrhoid surgeries in his office while his staff was milling around. Anyway, again, you look for a great character. And this guy was, yay tall, a bodybuilder, so he was as wide as he is tall, right? And, just sort of Coke bottle glasses. And she said, I'm a transsexual, which was the term that was used at the time. He goes, what's that? And she said, well, let me explain it to you. And he goes, yeah, I think I could do that. Let me do a little research. And he mailed somebody at Johns Hopkins who had done 17 of these surgeries, a guy named John Hoops. And John Hoops said, I'll send you some diagrams. So he sent, and these things look like if your 5-year-old was studying gynecology, this is what you'd have up on the refrigerator. So Stanley Biber looks at these things and said, yeah, I think I can do that. Sure, come on in. And did one, and it kind of worked. She was happy with the results. It was what's called a vaginoplasty, turning a penis into a vagina. He got better and better at it. Word started to spread, but it wasn't because of his skill as a surgeon. It was because of his non-judgmental acceptance of the people who came to him. And so word got around. People said, and this was happening simultaneously with the shutdown of some of the major clinics. Johns Hopkins in 1979 shut down its gender clinic. Somebody in their administration decided that this isn't valid surgery. So they shut it down. UCLA shut down their program. Suddenly, Trinidad was the last place to go. And the word got around. And Stanley Biber was just a, country doctor who happened to have a specialty that was in great demand among a small portion of the population. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Is the surgery available in more sites now?
It is. It's the kind of surgery that's surgeon-specific. Trinidad became the place because that's where Stanley Biber was. Now there are surgeons who specialize it in the Bay Area in San Francisco, in Montreal, in Tokyo, in Bangkok. My favorite is Tehran. Apparently, transgender surgery, this kind of surgery, is acceptable in Muslim countries, better than being gay. Literally, that's the kind of rationale that they use. And there's a surgeon that practices in Tehran, very successful. So it's always been surgeon-specific. But yes, it's much more widespread now. Marcie Bowers is now, she left Trinidad in 2010. She ended up in the Bay Area in Burlingame, California, just south of San Francisco Airport. Her practice is thriving there. She is now the president of the what's called WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the worldwide organization that develops protocols for this kind of surgery. So she's done very well. She, by working at Stanley Biber's side for a few years, stood her in great standing. So, anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Now we'll hear from finalists in the biography category. Jane Little Botkin will read from her book, The Girl Who Dared to Defy, Jane Street and the Rebel Maids. Jane became intrigued with Jane Street after learning her grandmother, born in 1898 in Denver, worked as a domestic in a Boulder mansion in 1916. She melds American families' personal narratives with compelling stories of women, labor radicals, miners, lawmen, and outlaws in rich settings that transition into the New West. Botkin has won 5 awards, including 2 Spur Awards from the Western Writers of America and the Caroline Bancroft History Prize for Frank Little and the IWW, The Blood That Stained an American Family. Jane lives in New Mexico.
I became interested in Jane Street when I was researching for Frank Little and the IWW. Frank Little was my great-granduncle who was murdered in Butte, Montana in 1917, August 1st, 1917. And because of his murder, actually the Sedition Act was passed in 1918. When we lost free speech, there was censorship of what people, their opinions about the government, the American flag, the military uniform, that sort of thing. We had this uber paranoia going across the United States. He was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a very radical organization at that time, might not be considered so radical today, and the United States government wanted to shut it down because they were fairly opposed to World War I. Not all of them, but many of them were. And Frank had been talking and giving speeches because of the miners whom he was supporting in Butte, Montana, where he met his death. I was fascinated with him, and I knew my family had a story. I thought that they were ashamed of him, but it turned out my family was afraid of the government. After my great-grandfather was arrested, my other great-uncle was in jail for 5 or 6 months, and I had to tell that story. And in doing so, I came across the fact that Frank, shortly before his death, had helped a housemaid, organize maids in Denver, Colorado. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. The Industrial Workers of the World was an organization formed in 1905 primarily because of the Colorado labor wars here. It was primarily because of the treatment of the miners. Military necessity, Governor Peabody, who would not allow the $3 8-hour day, which was passed legislatively here in 1902, he would not let that to go into effect because of the mining corporations. And because of this abuse, miners struck, and when miners struck, then the mining companies and the propaganda, the newspapers that they owned, came back against the miners, and there were a lot of things that today we would say, we can't believe this happened. That happened to American people. It actually went to the Supreme Court in 1909 with Clarence Darrow was the attorney for the IWW because of Big Bill Haywood, William Warrior, who was president of the Western Federation of Miners. They had been arrested because they made a map of, it wasn't a map, it was an illustration of the American flag, and it says, is Colorado really in America? And it was saying, there's no habeas corpus, you can't meet, there's no assembly and all that sort of thing. Well, that was desecration of the American flag, so they went to jail. And in 1909, after this was argued and lost and then appealed and went to the Supreme Court, their case was lost because of the rule of military necessity. Military necessity meant that you could do whatever you wanted to do to the workers if that was the best for the country. I'm saying that in a nutshell. It actually is a little bit longer. So Frank met Jane Street shortly before he was murdered. He met her in Bisbee, Arizona. I was fascinated with her. And shortly after that, I found out that my own grandmother had been a maid in Boulder. She was born here in Denver. Her mother was probably a prostitute. That's what we pretty much figured out. And my great-grandmother was following miners in mining camps. And my grandmother was born here, 1898, no father. And, like what all women did is they'd say, finally, after they were tired of the business, I'm widowed, and this is my one child I have. And that was my grandmother. And so my great-grandmother ended up marrying it was a mining superintendent in Louisville, where my grandmother was raised. And then after my great-grandmother died and my step-grandfather died, my grandmother was whisked away to Iowa into a forced marriage with a Scandinavian farmer twice her age. She was 15. She ran away, came back to the Denver area, went to Boulder, and hid in a mansion working for a family. And that, I found out, was very similar to many of the stories of the women, the girls, who worked here in Denver on Capitol Hill. How did Jane Street get involved? Jane was from Arkansas. She moved to California. She got a job as a stenographer. She wasn't even a maid. But in 1914, Ludlow happened. And when Ludlow happened, and the women and the children who died in that one tent number 58, asphyxiated or burned underneath, where you had 11 children die and 2 women, one of them whom was pregnant. Jane was a single mother, very much for mother and children, and she could not believe this. She was a young woman. She heard Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was probably the most famous wobbly rebel girl there was. The Wobblies, as a shortened form for IWW, I should say this right now. This union was radical in that, unlike the AFL at the time, you could, any gender could join. The AFL excluded primarily women. It was white. It excluded all people of color. The IWW took Hispanics, minors. If you were a Mexican, you were only allowed to work top jobs. Black people were not allowed to work at all in the other unions, trade unions. And the IWW was not a trade union. It was just a union for industrial workers. So you didn't even have to have a skill. So it was like a big tent, and everybody wanted to join. Very radical at the time. And Jane had joined. She'd become radicalized in California. She joined the IWW. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is going across the nation, and she's speaking about what happened at Ludlow. And she said all mothers, daughters, wives, sisters should be outraged. It doesn't matter what your social status is. You should be outraged at what happened at Ludlow. And then she said, the mistress in the parlor has nothing to do with the maid in the kitchen. And something clicked. And Jane showed up in late 1915, and she had made up her mind she was going to punish the wives of these men who had been part of the Colorado militia. Many of them, like, for example, General Chase was a well-known ophthalmologist on Capitol Hill. And these women had criticized the women who died in the tent, saying, they're nothing but cattle. They're just miners' wives. Who gives a big deal about it? They got what they deserved. And she said, okay. So she comes to Denver. She gets a job for 3 months as a maid, and she decides to punish them. So I'm going to read you, oh, by the way, there are some great characters, and as I call them characters, these are real people. I am a historian. I do deep research. And Louise Sneed Hill is a great person in this particular book, as are many other Capitol Hill ladies. I will tell you, before I read this, that Jane faced great opposition. The Wobblies were supposed to be inclusive for women, but it turned out that many of the men who were Wobblies in Denver were very jealous of her. They argued about who was going to soapbox on a particular corner, and they became so angered with her that they were making reports back to Chicago to Big Bill Haywood, who at that time was the General Secretary Treasurer of the IWW, that Jane was really running a whorehouse. Not. But anyway, so that kind of gets interesting. But anyway, this is the beginning of chapter 4. I'm going to read just a few pages from chapter 4. The book begins with the Ludlow Massacre, and then I go back and tell the story. Okay. The two eggs lay side by side in a kitchen icebox of a prominent merchant's residence on Capitol Hill in Denver, Colorado. One early spring morning, one was virgin fresh, while the other exhaled age, cheapness, and cold storage. Inspecting the icebox for her mistress's morning with breakfast was Mary the cook. I can't see my book because the microphone's in the way. Hang on, let me shift over here. Inspecting the icebox for her mistress's morning breakfast was Mary the cook. She pondered its contents. She knew that the freshly laid egg was specially ordered, but a momentary inspiration niggled at her brain. As Mary reached inside to grasp the egg, memories of a long list of grievances against Mrs. T, her mistress, suddenly erupted. The cook hesitated, and as uncertainty turned into deliberate decision, Mary selected the newer egg and tossed it into a pot of boiling water, heating on the stove. Minutes later, she ate it. Mary next boiled the egg, the older egg, and served it to her mistress. How the esteemed madam could determine her breakfast consisted of an old egg is up to speculation, but the cook soon found herself out on the street. Only after calling a policeman could Mary retrieve her clothes and money from the great home. That same night, March 26, 1916, Mary, in her best clothes and carrying a worn purse, arrived at her first experience meeting, joining other disgruntled servants who had ridden a creaky elevator to the third floor of the ancient Charles building, which Karl is no longer here, okay, on the corner of 15th and Curtis Streets, a low-rent property engaged for the new Domestic Workers Industrial Union, also called then the DWIU, local number 113. Housemaid after housemaid, cook after cook, rose to describe her experiences working in the homes of Capitol Hill's rich. The Denver Post later reported that the women did not murder the King's English when they got up to speak, and though their clothing was not as smart as that seen behind the department store counters, their faces were the faces of intelligent, determined American women. After Mary shared her story, one cook empathized with her. I worked for Mrs. X. She always thought the best for her family to eat, but the cheapest cold storage eggs she could buy for the servants to eat. When one neat, efficient-looking cook asked if anyone had ever worked for Mrs. Blank, laughter rippled through the room. Many indignantly answered, I should say I did. Then the cook went on to describe how she was dismissed for serving too heavy or too much food, despite the wishes of Mrs. Blank's husband and daughter who liked the servants' cooking. Another pretty, refined-looking girl also commiserated, testifying that her mistress was so penurious that the cook had to spend her own wages every week to purchase meat for herself. Mary probably felt exhilarated to hear others tell similar stories. This was a sisterhood for sure, for certain, since everyone shared their pain and indignation. More women spoke out loudly, though politely giving the floor to timid girls inexperienced with speaking out. Mary heard shared tales of tyrannical, bad-tempered mistresses who demanded 15, 18, and 20-hour workdays that culminated in poor beds in drafty attic rooms. One poor girl admitted that working a month on any one job was so taxing that before going to her next assignment, she had to have rest. The meeting was secret, and a sharp lookout was engaged to keep an eye out for reporters and spies from Denver mistresses. Yet, next day, the Post's light commentary sympathetically confirmed the housemaid's testimonies, stating that insurance companies considered the servants the worst risks of any class of women on their books. The fact that the meeting was reported in 2 Denver newspapers afterward, though humorously concealing the names of the outed mistresses, suggests immense failure regarding the meeting's intended secrecy, or perhaps a certain calculation on the part of the organizer. Leading the discussion of the second official DWIU local number 113 meeting was fiery little Jane Street, as described by the disguised Post reporter in attendance, who gave her own experiences working in the kitchen of one Denver mistress. Mary and the other women viewed Jane with curiosity. The diminutive woman standing in front of them was energetic, feisty, and fearless, not tired, downtrodden, and submissive. How could she talk rebellion? It was unnatural for servants to question their masters and mistresses. In fact, the entire meeting seemed surreal, even illegal, though no laws had been broken. This young woman was awakening them to the realization that she could voice complaints about work, share commiserations, and unite with purpose. They could not peel their eyes away from Jane Street. Now, what happened was Jane came into town, and she worked for about 3 months. She was so smart. She was a stenographer, very, very organized. And so what she did is she started running ads in the newspaper, say, looking for a cook. And she would use her phone number or her address, her mailing address. There would be girls or women looking to become cooks, and they would contact her. And she'd say, oh, no, I have the place to send you. She'd already found another address in the newspaper to send them to work as a cook. And she'd say, I need your personal information. Go. If it doesn't work out, come back. And in that way, she started collecting the names of the domestics. When they came back and if something was wrong, she said, well, tell me what was wrong with the job. Soon she had enough names of domestics on Denver's Capitol Hill, she was able to have these experience meetings. When these girls walked in, and they called them girls, it didn't matter if you were 50 years old or you were 15, but you were girls. So when they walked in, she'd give them a card. She'd say, okay, what's your name? What are you working as? How many hours a day do you work? Where are you working? How large is the mansion you're working in? How many square feet? How many children are in that house? How much are you paid? Do you get Sundays off? Do you get any leisure time? And so forth. She collected that information. In the end, she ended up having a file system. She had over, I think she had at one time like 3,000 cards. Almost every wealthy woman in Denver. She controlled the employment agency. The girls were no longer going to the employment agency and paying $1. The mistresses were getting their maids from them. She controlled it. So these people would come to her, and she'd say, I need a job, it's whatever. They get the card out, and there was one advertised in the paper. Look her up. They'd look that person up. Oh, I'm not going to go work there. Pretty soon, no one would work for certain mistresses. They were training the mistresses. She was highly successful, highly successful. So who did she make enemies of? The mistresses on Capitol Hill, the employment agencies, and the male wobblies. Louise Sneed Hill is an interesting person because all of her servants were happily employed. And she wanted to make sure everybody knew that. And got it. And she tried to ally with Jane Street. Okay. Any questions? Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the archives or other resources?
There was only, when I started this, as I said, I'm a deep researcher. There was only one letter. It was in the National Archives, and it was discovered in the 1970s, and it was a letter, it's called the Mrs. Elmer Brews letter. Jane had written it to another organizer in Oklahoma, and she was telling how to organize. And what was interesting in the letter, she went through the whole steps in the process that I was just telling you, but she had trouble with the men. And she said, talked about industrialism going right out the window. When there's love, you cannot mix with men. She learned the hard way. Her clubhouse that she organized, also still standing on Franklin Street, I might add, I took pictures of it. She was broken into, she was quite abused. In fact, there was a sexual assault on her. There are a number of things that happened in this book. But after that, I knew that I'll search for everything I could find. Of course, I went to the newspapers and got that information on Jane. Two things that really, really helped me was the Bureau of Investigation files, what we know today as the FBI. They are online on Fold 3. And because the IWW were considered German agents, they put them in the files for like World War I. They were not. The IWW became called Imperial Wilhelm's Warriors. I want work, or I want whiskey. I mean, the newspapers did everything they could do to criticize the IWW because they were afraid of them. They had nothing to do with the Germans. But those files are there. So by the time she is discovered in 1917, once she's running, there's dossiers. And then they started watching her. And I won't tell you how that goes because by now the Sedition Act gets passed. And if you even hold the Sedition Act, if you have a pamphlet, a letter, you have anything that is critical of the United States government, you were arrested. Then the other thing that I discovered through Ancestry.com is I found her grandson. He was still alive. He had all of her writings. He had everything. And I recently donated those to History Colorado. Any other questions? All right. Oh, yes. She was the first, and I will tell you right now, she is just now really becoming recognized. A lot of it because of this book. The National Domestic Workers Alliance is in full gear. They started organizing a few years ago. They are right now, they have really gotten their act together. Smith College, there is a group of people there who have been working on this project. There have been bills before Congress that have not moved forward. I don't know if you know this, but all the way until now, domestic workers don't get time and a half. They don't get workman's comp. We have entirely different set of workers now doing domestic work. And I talk about this history in the book, The Servant Problem. And of course now we have women that are coming up from Central America and South America looking for jobs. Many of them are the unknown, hidden domestics that are working. And it's very easy to abuse them because they don't, some of them are illegal, a lot of them aren't. I'm from El Paso, and I remember growing up, it was always a Mexican wage. You paid Mexicans one thing. If you had a white woman working for you, she was paid differently. And those things are still happening. The National Workers Alliance is geared, and they are now recognizing these leaders. She started the first, and now they're recognizing since then. Since Eleanor Roosevelt, there was actually a push with Eleanor Roosevelt. So, yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that. What about the domestic workers? There have been a lot of cases that have been sort of enslaved, particularly from African and Middle Eastern.
Now that, for contemporary, I cannot tell you. I don't know. I will tell you that